So how was it seeing yourselves up there?
Well,
I liked the one of me when I was young.
Yeah, I loved your accent too. It's very strong.
well, it's sort of weird, but I want to say there are way more than two heroes, and there are a lot more heroes actually in this audience. Um, Gary Nabel, Gary Nabel, and John Muscola, and Glenda Gray, and Dan Baruch, and Lindsay Baden are all in the audience. Illustrate the roles that Bostonians, and of course we have a South African here and maybe they should stand up and we applaud them, both as here as actors and the narrators of this journey.
So I'm going to begin with some of my own questions, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. But my first question is, what do you hope that the audience will take away from this movie?
Well, first, it really sort of started out as a sort of a history, and it's amazing to me what a filmmaker can sort of make it to. But as I was watching it, it was sort of like, to me, to show that science is about people. And it's not just the scientists as people, it's the community as people. And that the funding of science through our taxes and the National Institute of Health, and that people working together in a common good, that when you, as I think the film said, that when you pull the boat, you can make amazing progress. And I think that the structure that happened with HIV, that we were able to build on it to make COVID. And if you take that COVID structure, you could solve Alzheimer's disease and other kinds of, and again, a lot of recalcitrant cancers. And, you know, when you have public-private partnerships and you do things that are communal together, there's this infrastructure that science brings and community brings and medical research brings. And if this film could actually show that, that would be sort of a dream that I hope that came out of this.
Wonderful. Tony?
Yeah, well, for the general public to appreciate that science is particularly when you have a formidable problem like this, it's tough work that doesn't just happen overnight. And if you look at, I mean, what I really was impressed with, enjoyed at the film, was the realistic portrayal of over a period, literally of decades, that it's fits and starts. You learn you do an experiment, you find that that doesn't work, but you get enough information to go to the next stage, and you find out this works a little and this doesn't work, and you go to the next stage. And I think people in this country, particularly now, with sort of a pushback on science in general, to appreciate that science got us the spectacular efficacy and effectiveness of antiretroviral drugs. Science, trudging the resilience, the creativity, the effort, is going to get us a vaccine. And that's the reason why you cannot pull back on the support of the fundamental, basic, and clinical research that got us to where we got with therapy, and that if we continue to support it, will get us to where we need to go with a vaccine. We cannot pull back from that effort. That's what I hope the public appreciates.
Wonderful. In medicine, it's often that doctors, patients, staff speak about disease as if they're fighting a war. They use language like cancer is invading the body. You are a survivor. We're losing ground. When I look, what struck me about the film was just how long this war has been going on, right? You said it's like a 45-year epidemic in some parts of the world. You were there from the very beginning, seeing the first casualties from HIV/AIDS. Could each of you describe your first encounter with an AIDS patient and what that was like for you?
Yeah, it was a couple of months after the first cases were reported in MMWR in June and July of 1981. I started admitting persons with HIV before it had a name and before it had an etiology, and certainly before it had a drug. And as depicted well by several of the people on the film, I describe it when I speak about it in the memoir that I wrote as sort of the dark years of my professional career, in that literally every one of our patients died and they were desperately ill. And the first one I saw was, well, maybe this is the worst what we're going to see. And then for the next several years, it was a repeat of that same situation, a lot of frustration. And I think, as I tell people quite honestly and sincerely, it's the courage and the resiliency of the people who went through it, which kept me as a scientist and as a clinician taking care of these people. It kept me going. Otherwise, it could have been very, very difficult to go through. Only when you see people who are actually going through it manifesting a degree of courage. So when you feel you're getting this post-traumatic stress that we all seem to have gotten to a greater or lesser degree, that you just want to push on because of the fact that we're dealing with a problem that was really, really unprecedented. Getting back, just one quick thing that you mentioned, we scientists talk about this is a war. Well, in infectious disease, it is the metaphor of a war is even more relevant because you have an identifiable enemy. In a lot of other serious diseases, you're not really sure what's the enemy. We have severe lupus that's killing you. Is it your T cells that are going against your kidney and your brain and your lung? But with infectious disease, it really is a war. You have an identifiable target. And that's the reason why we're still so excited about the possibility that we could prevent that identifiable target from infecting people.
Yeah, I think when I'm with students, I say, what's the first axiom of infectious disease? Never underestimate your pathogen. It is a constant war. I mean, for me, and I guess maybe it has to say with my persistence in this field, it's not just the first patient. I was charged to teach medical students medical virology at the University of Washington. And for HIV, I wanted them to learn not just about the virus, but the people who had the virus, and would bring in some of the patients in my clinic to teach them about what it was like living with HIV. And these were gay men. A lot of the students hadn't had that kind of instruction before. What was really sort of scarring to me was that for the first 4 or 5 years of this course, there's no patient who survived the next year to come back to actually teach the course again. And I think that the understanding of the importance of sort of the cadence to discovery, that people's lives actually make a difference, if you get a drug out a year sooner or 2 years sooner, and how that can make a difference in life.
Wow, that's very sobering. So I have a fun question for the two of you. Take us back to when Larry met Tony, right? So you've known each other for quite a while. How did you first meet, and what did you think of each other when you met each other?
You better answer that first.
Well, we met when we were both a lot younger. And we had met casually, but I do remember the first time I ever came to his office, one of, 150 some after visits. And I'm going in, it's a big office. It was a lovely office. And there were all sorts of plaques and crystals. It was like the Swarovski office of medicine with awards and all kinds of stuff. And it was like, whoa, okay, I better behave. But he's an incredibly wonderful person. He has a great sense of humor, incredible intellect, and incredible drive. And so we spent a lot of time in that office, and I was always sitting on the couch, and he'd be in this professorial chair. And he would sort of say, well, what therapy are we going to do today, Larry?
Well, so the story goes back a little further. Larry and I sort of were scientific colleagues, but not very close, and because we were dealing with different things on a scientific level. Then we began collaborating scientifically because I was doing work on the latency of HIV, and which was sort of the stepping stone to why you really needed a virus. Because if the virus, why you needed a vaccine, excuse me, because if the virus, once it infects somebody, integrates itself into a latent form, like literally within a very short period of time, you're not going to get rid of the virus. So that was, Larry and I were sort of intellectually wrestling with that, and we were having an actual scientific collaboration. When we when I became director of the Institute in 1984, it became, and I had already been working on HIV for literally, like I told you, from the summer of 1981. It became clear that I wanted to build a program for HIV as an extramural program, namely to fund investigators, many of which are in the audience right now. And part of it was to develop clinical trial networks that were able to test for drugs, the ACTG, the AIDS Clinical Trial Group. But when it became clear that we needed a vaccine, we really wanted to build an AIDS vaccine network, a clinical trials network. And that's when, as Larry mentioned, did I really tell that to you? to go bleep yourself? Yeah. That's when Larry and I
The answer is yes.
really got very, very close in the fact that I needed somebody to run that network because this was such an important problem. And Larry took that over and he's been doing it now for 27 years, 25 years.
Now, if the audience thinks, man, these are terrible questions, go to slido.com and enter your own questions. And some of them are coming in, so I'm going to turn to them now. But while I transition over to Slido, let me ask the two of you, it's so incredible how there was already this HIV research network that had been really finely tuned, working together. And when COVID-19 hit, there was a team ready to go. Once the COVID experience is sort of getting, you were getting past it, we have the vaccine. Was there anything you learned from the COVID-19 experience that could be maybe instructive as you turn your attention back to the HIV virus?
Yeah, I think I think you learn that you can improve the cadence of research. It wasn't just the money that went into Operation Warp Speed. It's how you work together in a way of getting the regulators and the pharmaceutical companies and the academic organizations that sort of tended to represent the public and the FDA together in a room. And that rather than waiting for 4 months to get the results from the phase 1 and start the phase 2, you did it in 48 hours or 72 hours. And that there's a human behavioral way that if we could improve the cadence of research, that would be something that I think, I myself actually am finding frustrating because I know we could work faster. And I think trying to get the public to understand that or get even the government officials to sort of rethink about how we do medical research generally for major public health issues. You can't work at that intensity, all the time, but you can increase the pace, I think, and improve our health from some of the issues. And there's a trust that goes along with working together because we are human. And if you are trusting, how the team, you get things done quicker.
Yeah. Well, I actually wrote a paper on your question a couple of years ago, and it was lessons learned. And there are a number of lessons. There were 8 to 10 of them. I won't go through with them, but I give you a couple of them that I felt were important. What we learned from HIV that helped us with COVID and what we'll learn from COVID that will help us from other. The first is expect the unexpected when you're dealing in biomedical research and public health. We didn't know, we didn't expect HIV. It came out of nowhere. We didn't expect COVID. It came out of nowhere. The second thing is that in both of those diseases, the solutions came from years previously of research, investment in basic and clinical biomedical research. The research that antedated HIV, that allowed us to respond with effective therapies, the discovery of reverse transcriptase, the ability to grow T cells in culture, the ability to do structure-based antiretroviral therapy design. Those were things that will absolutely help us. The next thing is that we need leadership. We need leadership from above. We need government leadership to be able to fund the incredible amount of talent that we have in the country. The other thing is that misinformation and disinformation is the enemy of public health. It was the enemy of public health with stigma with HIV, and it certainly in spades is the enemy of public health with COVID. I could give you 5 others, but we will go on later.
Okay, thank you. So what is the best theory of where HIV came from?
It's not a theory, it's a fact.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead first.
No, I mean, it's studies by Beatrice Hahn and her colleagues and a number of other people is that it started in a non-human primate in sub-Saharan Africa and jumped species at a time when the evolution of behavior in a particular geographic setting, normal behavior. I mean, just, you had the dissolution of colonization. So you had people working away from home. We had commercial sex workers. We had a number of other things. And when you have something like that and you don't introduce a virus into it, nothing happens. But when it jumps from a non-human primate into the human and you have what's going on in human, be it sexual behavior, injection drug use, you're going to have an outbreak. So there's very little question of where HIV came from.
Yeah, I mean, it's multiple zoonotic introductions. It's not just a single point source. It's been multiple that requires the why there's different clades and bushmeat, and then it's associated with the urbanization in Africa of going into the cities and then it having sexual acquisition.
Dissolution of the family structure when you go to the mines and things like that.
So, I mean, that's where your multiplier factor came in. Estimated to first, the origins would be around the 1920s. Our first earlier isolates are in the 1950s, and they come from the Kigali area and Zaire and the DRC.
Okay, another question. Andrew asks for the both of you, what is, to you, the hardest and or most important problem specifically that you're focused on solving over the next few years?
Well, I think the films are there. So for me, I have both HIV and I have herpes viruses. And so you would love to solve the problems that you first started on. So I'll just sort of stop there. I sort of view that this is an achievable goal to make an HIV vaccine. And I think that if the teams of people who are working on this together can be kept together, we will achieve that. And I think that what we learn about manipulating the immunology of HIV will pay off in autoimmune disease. And will also pay off in cancer immunotherapy because they are linked. And a lot of the technologies that we use, you see a lot of joint scientific meetings in which HIV and cancer immunologists are at together.
I assume that question is, what is the most important thing beyond, not necessarily in our own field, but in any field? Well, I'm going to stick with infectious disease because that's my field, but I'm in a situation, as many are in, where I'm an immunologist and an infectious disease person. And what I've been fascinated with is what we're seeing very, very dramatically with COVID is that infection with a virus can trigger a series of aberrant physiological and pathophysiological responses that in COVID leads to long COVID, but that resurrects what we've known for years, that viruses that people get can trigger cardiovascular disease, can trigger neurological diseases, can trigger autoimmune diseases. So if I had a lot more years, if I was a fellow coming out of a lab and wanted to study, I would study the relationship and the pathogenic mechanisms of how, when you get an influenza outbreak, 6 months later, the incidence of cardiovascular disease goes up highly significantly. You know, what is CMV doing to neurological diseases, and what are other viruses are doing? So ultimately, as an infectious disease person, I think infectious diseases cause most other diseases. Just
Okay, this is a question from a community advocate. So the film makes it very clear that a universal vaccine provision is needed to eradicate HIV, including for people who are unhoused, uninsured. Would either of you take part in community engagement by public advocacy for a no-fee HIV vaccine access to everyone if one were to be developed?
if we had the right kind of health care in this country, it would be no fee.
Right. I think, yeah. Okay. The answer is, I think, for both of us, of course.
The answer to that is yes.
Noted. So another question. So there are various clades of HIV. Why would it be easier to try to find a vaccine for each clade? Why go for like a universal vaccine?
Well, there's sort of lingo and practicality. I mean, most of our testing has been in clade C and clade B, but these broadly neutralizing antibodies go cross-clade. In some respects, why I think a global vaccine is better is because the manufacturability and the distribution. But the more you can simplify this and have a vaccine that will cover as much as you can, you will be able to implement it, because the cost of manufacturing regionally it decreases the market. At some point in time, companies are needed. They democratize the delivery of medicines, and so I think that's where I would come on the answer here.
Yeah, said another way, why go for 3 singles in a row when you can get a home run, right?
Well put. So what would you say for young people entering the workforce in biotech, wet lab research, knowing how long the road could be sometimes ahead for success? How do we convince high schoolers, college kids to dedicate their lives like you have to research outside of a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, the road is long, but there's an incredible amount of gratification of the incremental steps that you get to what an endpoint is. I mean, you could be working in science and not necessarily have as your ultimate goal the development of a product that's going to specifically address a certain disease, but the satisfaction you get out of discovering something that's never been known before, writing it up, letting the rest of the world know about it, and then letting that spawn multiple other extensions from your work. I mean, that's the beauty of science. I mean, the satisfaction that I've gotten in my career doesn't always result in an intervention that everybody's going to use, and yet the gratification and the satisfaction and the energy that you get from doing science and discovering something that's unknown, sharing it with your colleagues, and letting some of them take the ball and go with it. That's the thing that's exciting about the science. I mean, I don't want to tell somebody, well, you know, Larry's been working on a vaccine for X 30 years and we don't have a vaccine yet. You know, boy, he must be depressed, but he's not, because we do a lot of other things. Right?
You know, my mother would say that the joy is in the journey. But parsing it out, I mean, I think it's been incredible privilege to be a physician scientist. I wouldn't give up in a heartbeat. And it's a sort of privilege to be able to have your ideas sort of funded and worked on. But it's also a privilege to work with colleagues and young people and trying to help people. And so that's a really incredible, gratifying thing. Science actually is fun. Yes, it's hard work, but so are a lot of things in life. And I think trying to help people, make them better, and there's a universality that people throughout the world want to be healthy. And I think there's just something about that is a lot more appealing. As I try and recruit people in Seattle from Amazon, I sort of say, do you want to continue to make people better shopping, or do you want to help people's health? You know, more efficient shopping or making someone live longer? Where would you want to be?
Thanks. Okay, this is a terrific question from Lash. Can you each speak to how both of these viruses disproportionately impacted historically marginalized communities, including racialized minorities? How can we be more proactive in our protection of these communities in contemporary public health?
Well, when you talk about both these viruses, talking about HIV and COVID, it's really a very, I think, different because COVID affects anybody homogeneously, the virus itself. The people who suffer and get advanced disease most likely are the elderly, those with poor care, those who have underlying conditions, and a lot of the minority populations do because of the social determinants of health. So you're right, underserved people who don't have access to health care, who have never been in a situation where diseases like diabetes and obesity and hypertension could have been taken care of. Although COVID can universally affect anybody, we all know that. Practically everybody here has gotten infected with COVID. The people who suffer disproportionately are people who are somewhat, from a health standpoint, disenfranchised. They have poor health, poor economy, et cetera, et cetera. With HIV, it's different. It's a selective population. In this country, Africa, it's a different story. You know, it's the people who don't have the access to getting tested, for example, who don't have access to getting the kind of education how to avoid HIV. So I think that you're right. The end game is disenfranchised population. In the United States, it's gay men and the stigma associated with gay men. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's a different population, also in some respects disenfranchised. So HIV, I think, is a little bit different in that respect than COVID. But at the end of the day, the end result is still the same, that disenfranchised people wind up getting it more. Larry?
Well, I think the social determinants of health are sort of universal here. And I think that in COVID, we learned it really that it's the people who were in the service industry and were high risk, that they had higher exposures. And yes, they had less ability to get to the resources to be taken care of. And hospitals became overwhelmed sooner. And we saw the issue as it spread through South Africa and the world, where, they ran out of oxygen. And we were giving people oxygen in cars. They ran out of beds, in the parking lots, and then you run out of oxygen and people die because you don't have the right medical supplies. And so I think that this is the implementation of the things we discover. I guess I was surprised and upset, and it's a learning issue, that we developed the vaccine sooner than we implemented its distribution in our country. And that is, to some extent, one should take a look at that as to why. Why'd that have to be that way?
That's another whole problem in society, is if the vaccine was accepted by society, we didn't have a anti-vax problem, we would have had a much, much more effective distribution of vaccine in this country. You're absolutely right. I mean, if everybody universally accepted that this was a safe and effective vaccine, we were trying to get 72% of the population vaccinated, and we never really got there. Whereas other countries had 85, 90% of their people vaccinated. So I think it depends on the country. That's different than the inequity that you have globally, which is, I think, more of a problem, that we had people getting their second and third booster before people in the developing world were getting their first shot. That's just unconscionable.
Well, that brings me to my last question. When I was watching the film, I thought, imagine a world where we are on the verge of, or we do actually have an HIV vaccine. Would everybody be recommended to get it? At what age? And can you imagine the pushback in the U.S. for something like that?
Well, science literacy and policy literacy. We've done, it's taken a while. It's gradually occurring that HPV vaccine is being given to adolescents. I would sort of say that if we have an effective HIV vaccine, it would be an adolescent vaccine. That's when you would, start doing that. So you would build upon that. And as I said on the film, I get my granddaughters and grandsons there. And I think that it would be important for the world to make sure that it gets distributed throughout sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Brazil, throughout, Peru. I think the vaccine is going to be safe and it needs to be durable. We should be able to make particles or other kinds of vaccines with adjuvants that allow that kind of durability with what's being done now. And I see it that that's how you go from 1.3 million to 100,000 a year. And I think that's the way it gets to be done.
It's complicated. I agree with your answer, but the question is of what should be done and what would be done. In other words, what would accept. So if you have a country, make up a fantasy country in which
The PSA.
of which the incidence of HIV, or let's say the prevalence in the community, is 0.2%. Would you convince the population to get vaccinated? If you have a country in which the prevalence is 16%, that's different. Then you absolutely want to vaccinate the entire population. And you probably would have an acceptance, at least a reasonable acceptance of that. I think if you have a situation where we have a fundamental anti-vax issue right now, to tell them to get vaccinated against a disease that they don't know anybody who gets that disease, and the prevalence so low, even though, there would, particularly with a safe vaccine, there would be no reason not to do it. I don't think you would ever get a region or a country like that to get a universal vaccine for the entire population when the disease is very, very minor. So it depends on what conceptually would be the thing that should be done versus what actually would be acceptable by the community. That's what I mean by it's a complicated situation.
Wonderful. So I said that was my last question, but I lied. I have one more. And I like to ask all my guests this type of question, which is, can you tell the audience one action item that they can take? What can they do in their everyday lives that will kind of help the cause that you're fighting for?
Yeah. Vote.
You can't top that. But I would say write also to advocate for whatever is your passion, because I do think maybe at least in the old days, congresspersons are influenced by what their constituents say and the economics of their constituency. Medical research, there's a selection bias here in this audience, is an important economic driver of these communities. And I think that there's a larger voice than one can think if one, spends time outlining the importance of that to congresspersons.
Well, the generals in the HIV wars have spoken. You have your marching orders. And with that, I'd love to thank you once again for being with us here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Larry Corey and Anthony Fauci.